Greetings, welcome back to our study on becoming God's people, looking at the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy and the formation of Israel and how that can help us become a better version of God's people today. This week we are looking at Exodus 20. Specifically, I'm targeting verses 12 through 17 in my reflection, and we'll talk a little bit about those verses specifically. But to begin with, I wanted to talk about how different groups have divided what we commonly call the Ten Commandments and how that's been used and abused a little bit in history. Specifically, when I talk about this, there are several different ways to divide this passage, Exodus 20, verse 1 through verse 17. There are a number of different ways. We understand that there are 10 specific words or instructions from God. That's kind of the traditional way to divide them, but there's more than 10 individual instructions listed depending on how you break them down. So the obvious differences in Jewish tradition, a lot of Jewish traditions list what we call the preamble in the Protestant version. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Israelite or Jewish tradition will say that is the first word. And they begin to break down the list a little differently. Some are obvious, some are less obvious. So the major difference in history and how it's played out is between Catholics and most Protestants. Most Catholics or Catholic tradition has broken down the idea that you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall make no idols. Where in Protestant traditions they will list that out as the first two. In Catholic traditions they push that under one. And then in the last of the 10, where Protestants will traditionally have do not covet and just have that being an overarching command, Catholic tradition will break that down into do not covet your neighbor's wife and do not covet your neighbor's property as two distinct clauses, just to show that the relationship between husband and wife is different than owner and property. That's been a highlight in Catholic theology. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it has been abused in the United States, specifically in the late 1800s. A number of Catholic immigrants were coming to the United States from Southern Europe, from Italy and the Balkans and Greece and that area. A lot of Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans who were Catholic. And in part of the racist orientation at the time, the instrument to keep them out and keep them kind of as second-class citizens was their Catholicism. And many in America would use fear tactics, would use scare tactics to differentiate Catholics and Protestants by saying that Catholics divide the Ten Commandments and they omit do not make idols, so specifically so they can make idols and worship these idols, what we would now look at as statues to the saints. This was used as a smear campaign in the late 1800s, early 1900s against Eastern European Catholics in order to further the cause of keeping the United States racially pure. This is something that we have to recognize when we come into biblical studies. Not that specific topic, but that sometimes we use these passages and we weaponize them against others in a way that is not fair. We don't hear them out and hear how they they interpret the passages. We just use the difference to bash people over the head, and that is wrong. Yes, there are differences between Protestants and Catholics, and yes, I have my own feelings on this. Obviously, I am not Catholic, therefore, I don't necessarily hold uh, to their breakdowns and to their theology, but I recognize that what I can do is either listen to them and why they justify their differences the way they do, or I can make up my own excuses and try to beat them over the head and make them sound um, like they are second tier in some way, or completely wrong, or heretical, or whatever word I want to use. And I think in our current culture, we are shifting towards that second. We are shifting towards beating people over the head with the distinctions and the differences instead of actually listening and looking at the historical record and talking through some of the issues. And I wanted to highlight that because this is one of those areas where a stupid minor distinction in the way we break down the Ten Commandments that isn't even part of the text itself. It is not even part of the Bible. This distinction was used to harm individuals and keep them out instead of looking at it as, oh, this is a difference and we can talk about that and grow together, instead of looking at it as an area where we can talk through and remain distinct, remain independent, but talk through and understand each other. It was used as a way to bash people, and that's just not appropriate. The second thing that we need to look at when we come to this Ten Commandments, this list, is we need to acknowledge, and this is a major theme. And even though I highlighted it in the reflection, it's so major, I want to highlight it here. The Ten Commandments are not specific laws. As much as we might try to think that they are specific laws, this is good meditation literature. This is something, when you read it, you are supposed to ask yourself, how do my actions, how does my life fit within the boundaries described in this passage? Even something that seems relatively simple to us, like do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not murder. When we step back and we look at those words in Hebrew, they're a little more ambiguous than our English words tend to give them. For instance, what is often translated do not murder or do not kill is kind of somewhere in the middle there. It is, in some ways, the best definition might be do not commit an unjustified or unjustifiable killing. Now, that has a lot of gray area in it, and it's not something that can be pinned down by a law. And in fact, this is why Jesus will say, you have heard it said, do not murder, but I tell you, do not even hate your brother. The reason is because where that law or that command or whatever you want, however you want to say it, I like the word instruction, where that instruction is trying to say, what that instruction is trying to say to you is, what does it mean for me to commit an unjustified killing? And this is something that we have to wrestle with. And what it's going to come down to is if there's hatred, if there's animosity, if there's anger against somebody, if there is in any way something other than love driving you, eventually you could be in a position of unjustified killing. It's a really deep hole, and I'm doing it very little service by trying to oversimplify and talk about it quickly. But what Jesus is getting at when he reads these instructions is these are meant to be words that you ponder every day, all day, and ask yourself, are my actions, is my lifestyle honoring my parents? Is it bringing them honor? If so, in what ways? In what ways might it not be? Is my lifestyle stealing from others? And again, this is a word that can have multiple meanings. It is not just as cut and dry as our English sometimes is, of physically taking something that does not belong to me but belongs to another. It's not so cut and dry, especially when you think about the fact that you have stealing paired up with coveting, which is a wrong desire of another person's property. So if stealing is just taking that person's property, well, then wouldn't coveting necessarily cover all of that? In other words, we have more here to meditate on, and these are not meant to be just laws of do's and don'ts. They are meant to be boundaries that we meditate on how these boundaries interact with our lives and how we can further our lives by meditating on God's ideal society, which this is the ideal society. And then pondering how not to push that on others, which is part of the reason why I would oppose a lot of these bills that force the Ten Commandments to be hung in schools and in public places, because they're not meant to be pushed on others. They are meant for something for the Israelites to accept onto themselves willingly. This is a boundary that I am willingly accepting because I want to love God the way God loves me. I want to show God a reciprocal kind of love, so I willingly accept these instructions for my own life. It is not something that is meant to be pushed onto another person as if this is how all of our society must act. The great thing I learned this week in studying this was that in Hebrew, these are all second person singular words. In other words, instead of second person plural, which would mean Israel as a whole, it's second person singular. It's addressed to each person in Israel. Each person has to make this decision for themselves. So that's the Ten Commandments this week. They are not a list of do's and don'ts in the sense of rules and regulations. They are God's instructions for an ideal society that each individual Israelite has to ask themselves, do I want to be a part of this? And if the answer is yes, then you live by this. If the answer is no, then you don't, and you're not part of God's society. And that's how that works. This is not something to be understood in a day or a week. It is something to be pondered and meditated on for months and years. So I hope that at least starts your process of meditation on this. If there are any questions or comments on this, please reach out to me. Let me know. I'd appreciate hearing from you. In the meantime, God bless. I hope you have a great day.